Um, I think we've waited for about 5 minutes. It's only fair that we respect the people who are here on time. So I'm going to start, and hopefully people will join, and we can have a good conversation. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Liben Gebremikael. I'm the Executive Director of Taibu Community Health Center, and I'm really looking forward for presentation, engagement, conversation, questions. Before I start the session, if you have any questions, please place your questions in the Q&A in the stream area. You will find it in the stream area, so that I can review those questions, and maybe I will include those questions in my conversation, or I will make sure that I'll answer those questions towards the end. The idea is to make sure that you are getting the information that you require. So I really do appreciate if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A section in the stream area. So as I said earlier on, my name is Liben Gebremikael. I'm very pleased to be here with you to talk about two important topics. One around governance and Black governance, and two around systems change and how do we bring about Black governance or Black focused governance or governance through Afrocentric lens to bring about system change is the kind of topic that I would be sharing with you. I want to start by just telling you a little bit about the organization. So Taibu Community Health Center was established about 12 and a half years ago now, and it was established by an organization called the Black Health Alliance, and the concept came from the desire to create a space and a center that is focused on addressing the health and social disparities that the Black community faces. And so we are located in Scarborough in the Malvern neighborhood area, but our mandate is to provide services to the Black community across the GTA. So we serve the Black community across the GTA, which is quite a huge task and a significant mandate. But we are also have a mandate that we have to serve the local community here in the Malvern neighborhood area. And over the years, we have also added a couple of focuses on two specific populations, one being the indigenous population in Scarborough. And we also have a special focus on the Francophone communities in Scarborough, because there are no either indigenous-led or culturally and linguistically appropriate services for those populations. This is our vision and our mission, and our values around leadership, community-driven, Afrocentricity, and quality are the basic kind of values that we do. Over the years, our board of directors have been crafting and developing the direction where the organization should be going. And from our current strategic plan is really looking at how we can build excellence in Black community based health practices. We have three priorities right now. The first one is really strengthening ourselves as an organization with our operational capacity. So looking inside and making sure that we continue to grow as an organization and we are strong as an organization. That's our first priority. The second priority is looking around us and making sure that we work with significant partners and collaborators. So strategic partnership and collaboration is our second priority. And knowing that when working with systemic issues, partnership, collaboration, alliances are very, very important. And our third priority is really raising our profile but also using a communication as a way to promote access and to bring about action and change. So this is what Taibu is as an organization. As you all know, and I don't have to kind of lecture around this, we as Black communities are really faced with significant systemic barriers. And these barriers manifest themselves or demonstrate themselves in various ways. As a community health center, we are looking at, we've been looking at different areas where disproportionality and disparities exist. So for example, we know, we don't have a lot of data and race-based data here in Canada. We are beginning to get there, but when we look at information and statistics from the States, for example, from the United States, south of the border, we look at HIV adjusted death rate per 100,000 population in 2017 in the States. You can see where the Black community really stands. It's quite significant, right? It's about 300% of all races, and it's about 620% more than the white population. So these are the kind of disparities and inequities that we're looking at. If you look at diabetes incidence rate, death rate per 100,000 again, you will see that it's about almost double of the white population. You look at homicides rate, for example, it's significantly higher even compared to the other racialized and marginalized groups. Breast cancer diagnosis death rates. You would see here, for example, the diagnosis of breast cancer among white women and Black women is almost the same. It's probably a little bit lower for the Black women being diagnosed with breast cancer. But you will find out that the death rate is higher for the Black population compared to the other races. It's about 22%. So even though same number of women are diagnosed with breast cancer, more Black women die from breast cancer. And so these are very systemic issues. The same thing with cervical cancer. The diagnosis rate and the death rate is quite higher compared to the white population. You look at colon cancer diagnosis death rates, it's the same thing, significantly higher for the Black community compared to the other races. Prostate cancer is also significantly higher in the States. It's also significantly higher for the indigenous communities. So we see some very, very systemic issues when we're talking about healthcare or health services and access to healthcare. In the Canadian context, it's not too different. If you look at HIV/AIDS in 2016, for example, 61% of new incidents of HIV was with Black women. So overrepresented in HIV/AIDS as incidences. If you look at income, if you look at food security, if you look at perception of discrimination, if you look at diabetes rate, if you look at mental health, in all areas, we are significantly overrepresented, or in another way is we are at the bottom of every health and social services outcomes. We are really at the bottom. And in some cases, we're also at the bottom, the least bottom. It's usually either the indigenous communities or the Black communities who are at the bottom of any health and social services outcome. So the situation, even though we don't have the data as much as we have it in the United States, it's not different here in the Canadian context. And recently there has been some reports, like for example, the Black North Project has put out some reports to show us that if it is in unemployment, particularly with youth unemployment, we are significantly overrepresented in unemployment rates. With school and education, even though we know that the percentage of Black students in the TDSB is only 12%. 42 and 48% of suspensions and expulsions are Black students. Why is this happening? Is it because Black students are more disruptive in school, have exhibit, very difficult behaviors? No, it is because there are some systemic issues that are contributing to this inequality or inequity. It's the same thing with, overrepresentation in all type of police use force incidents. And we've seen this quite a lot recently. And, the movement that we have now that is actually presenting some opportunities for some change is because of these disparities that are existing. If you look at representation of Black communities or Black representations at senior executive, it's actually less than 1% in the Canadian context. This is kind of very significant and alarming, right? So with all these things, and then we can add some more statistics that we know of. For example, 40% of children in care are Black children or children from Black parents and Black households. So we can add some, overrepresentation of people, of Black people in the mental health institutions, particularly in forensic mental health institutions. The underrepresentation of Black students in post-secondary education. I mean, we can bring all this information and data, and all these point to the fact that there are some very endemic, long-standing, deep-seated systemic barriers that exist that are really creating those challenges and barriers for the Black community. And these systemic barriers and challenges can only be addressed with an approach of a systems change approach to the problem that we're facing. Because we know, you probably very well know, that any amount of programming that has happened for years and years has not been able to bring about some changes in this area, right? So systemic barriers really need some very concrete, deep-seated systemic change approaches to the problem that we're facing. And this is, I'm bringing this as a context because this is where we have moved as an organization, and we're looking at board governance as one of the systems change ideas. People who have done a lot of work around systems change, and one organization, the FCG, Reimagining Social Change, have been talking about systems change and what is required in order to bring about effective systems change. And they have identified 3 conditions that are helpful, conducive, and important for systems change. They have grouped them in three hierarchies, and the first one being some structural change, which is very obvious and it can be seen, and it involves looking at policies and making changes around policy, changing some practices, and making sure that also with changes in policies and changes in practices, there is supporting resources that follow. Usually we see that there are some changes in policies, but there are no resource allocations to make those policy changes or to implement those policy changes, also around practices. So they're talking about making some structural changes in order to affect systems. The second hierarchy is the relational change, and that is about relationship and connections, and also changing power dynamics, which is also very, very critical and very, very important. And then the third structure or hierarchy would be the mental models of a transformative change. So there is the explicit structural change, there is the relational semi-explicit change, and then there is implicit, those things that we don't see but can only be seen through attitudes and behavior and prejudices, and those where some of the changes are, should happen. In most of, at least my experience, if I can share my experience, Usually we try to kind of address mental models and changes when we're talking about change and anti-Black racism. For example, the first thing that comes to mind for people to be engaged with is doing anti-oppression, anti-racism training. But without any of the policies or dynamics or practices or resource flows changing, that cannot really bring about the systems change. So this kind of 6 conditions of systems change is something that we have been considering in terms of bringing about change, and particularly as it relates to governance. And I will talk a little bit more about that and how at Taibu we have kind of the journey of where we are today in terms of thinking about systems change and board governance. So we are a community health center, and we belong to our association, the Alliance for Healthier Communities. And the Alliance for Healthier Communities has its own model of health and well-being that incorporates different domains and different areas. For example, health equity and social justice being one, higher quality and people and community centered being another, or building community vitality and belongingness being the overarching kind of areas. And then within that, we have about 8 domains that will talk about accessibility, that is population focused and population needs and based programming grounded in community development. Those are the kind of principles and values that the model of health and well-being presents or prescribes for us from the Alliance for Healthy Communities. But at Taibu, what we have done is we've taken some, we've looked at different models, but because of the mandate that we have, we really wanted to make sure that the values and principles that we follow are also connected to who we are as a community and where we come from. And so we've tried to include some of the Afrocentric principles and translate them into languages for our own kind of way of planning and being in the organization. So we're looking at the different kind of Afrocentric values and principles and making sure that they're related to what we want to do, whether it's accountability and efficiency, whether it's about quality, whether it's about self-determination and nothing about us without us. So how can we make sure that our communities are involved in our planning and conversation and discussion, the collective work and responsibility, the holistic health approach and looking at health from various perspectives, including the social determinants of health, but also looking at health from an emotional, social, spiritual lens and looking at the whole person. So believing that if we don't grow and move as a community, then we won't achieve health and well-being just by working on an individual basis, and making sure that anti-racism and anti-Black racism and intersectionality are part of our model of being. And so within that, we have created what we call the Taibu model of Black health and well-being that incorporates these elements and principles that looks at some of our goals being prevention, restoration, and advancement as a community, making sure that intersectionality of the different values that we will bring, the Afrocentricity and the quality are some of the principles that we follow. Yes, there is a question there that says, will we be able to have the presentation sent to us? I believe the organizer will be sending out the presentation. It will be available to you. And then focusing on social determinants of health, building collaborative approach, making it accessible, and also community driven is what our practice is going to be in order to achieve Black health and well-being. So this is just as a context, as a foundational issue, like I'm bringing this idea about systems change because it's very important. And when we're talking about systems change, and if I just give you an example of where this is very important, we're looking at, for example, if we look at the youth and adolescent population, what do we mean by systems change, for example? And so, or general kind of a way of making sure that our communities are going to be moving towards the area of health and well-being, right? We have to ensure that our population and our youth particularly have a positive school experience, because some of the challenges begin there and continue to present barriers and challenges. The engagement with education, employment, and training have been identified as another sector or another area where we need to bring about some changes. Mental health and well-being and health is also another key area for our communities where we need to bring about change. And then criminal justice is also another area that we are working to make sure that these areas, if we are able to bring about change in these areas, thinking about systems, this is where we can really bring about effective change. But without looking at governance and leadership changing as well, whether it is with organization, with mainstream organizations or institutions, then maybe, as we said earlier on, maybe mental models can be changed or some relationship can be changed, but the actual structure would not be changed. So we have designed this model where all of programs are going to be connected to each other and connect to the systems that they belong to. And then within that, we would have also a component around governance and leadership to bring about that systems change. So I will give you an example. We have a project called the Plug Project that deals with the issues of Black students and their experience in schools, whether it's suspension, or expulsion, or even educational attainment. So we have a project around that. With regard to employment, education, and training, we have developed a program called From School to Success Project that is really trying to kind of disrupt what is usually known as the From School to Prison pipeline project. So this is around developing and co-designing with youth a career pathway that is more successful for them, and not so much about how system is developing a career pathway for them. And then with the mental health and well-being component, we have developed the Imara Generation Project that's also co-designing with youth about how they can build a peer-led mental health mentorship and leadership skill for themselves so that they can support each other. We are now working on developing something around criminal justice. But the idea here is, with all this happening, we are also making sure that there is a component around Black governance and leadership project, so that we are connecting all these programs and activities with the idea that, number one, it's a systems change approach, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but there is also a component of changing or interrupting what is happening at the governance and leadership project for organizations. So when we look at programs, for example, this is a model for our Plug Project program, which is the education program. And within the programs, we're also looking at systems, right? So when we have an issue around school discipline, it's not just that it is an issue for the student themselves, or it is an issue between the student and the teachers, for example. Even though that is one component, which is about the student-teacher relationship and things that are required there around the trust, empathy, communication, and then working around anti-Black racism and prejudice and stuff. But there are other issues around the school environment. There is the issue around parental support and strengthening what is happening in the community. There is the socioeconomic status that cannot be ignored, because we know what is happening with some of the Black students that are experiencing significant challenges around socioeconomic status. And then we have other issues around stress that young people are going through. And then there's also the individual student's need, which could be biological, could be emotional, could be social. So we're looking at programs also as a system, so that we are making sure that everybody is part of this coming together and developing a program for change. We have incorporated support for parents and students around legal representation, advocacy, knowledge of the education system. And also, we are also working with the schools, which are part of the program, to make sure that not only our program is helping the Black students, but also the teachers and the administrators are also finding ways of changing what they are doing in the school system. Because if we can if we can build the capacity for youth around their social skills, self-esteem, confidence, and things, but the school never changes, we are these things is not going to move anywhere, right? Because the school is going to continue to treat the students the way they are being treated without changing. So we have to include schools in the process, which we do. A similar example that I can give you is also here with with regard to our employment project that we have, right? The disenfranchised Black youth who are not connected to education, uh, employment, or training is not because, like I always give this example. When a youth goes to an employment agency, for example, the first thing that they will be asked is to bring their resume, and the job developer will help them brush their resume, making it look good, and then try to see if they can connect them to different networks and opportunities. Most of the Black youth who we're working with do not even have a resume for various reasons. And so we see that the services are starting at the wrong step where the youth are not there yet. So I think what we have tried to design here is we need to bridge that gap where, number one, we build the capacity of the youth through various programming, but we also need to address the issue where employment service agencies should also then meet the youth of where they are, so that we need to work with them and they need to hear from the youth and find the gap. So this project is now trying to bridge this gap so that we can change the employment services, for example. Or how can we build the capacity of the parents to be able to support their youth through this journey? And usually, people say, oh, parents are not involved and things like that. But if we really look at the needs of the parents themselves, they have a lot of other needs that needs to be addressed and supported to be able for them to support their youth so they can become successful. So we look at the system and we look at individual components of that system to bring about change in all directions. I spoke earlier on about the Imara project, which is a mental health project. And one of the things we always forget when developing programs for youth is the component for the parents is always missed. And for example, when it comes to mental health in our communities, the faith-based organizations are also very important because they also provide services. And in most cases, if not all cases, members of the community's first point of contact around mental health or stress is faith-based organization in the majority of cases, whether it is church, whether it's the mosque. That's where the first point of contact is. And if we don't bring the faith-based organization into the system and think about how we can resolve or how we can build capacity or how we can bridge, how we can increase communication, cross referrals, and things like this, then just working with the youth only or just working with the parents only will not bring about changes. So the idea and the approach for all the programming that we have is around based on systems change, where all system players have to be part of any design, of any programming, of any activity, where one is informing the other of what changes is required, and one is also making changes to adapt to this newer situation. And so that with that capacity building, we can also grow and bring about changes. So the kind of philosophy that we have around programming and service delivery and evaluation has the systems change component. So how is that then related to governance? And I think that's the second part that I would like to talk to you about, right? So we said Black governance and systems change. So we talked about system and systems change and what does that look like and why we should be doing that. And now around governance, making sure that that is also part of the component of how to drive systems change, particularly as it relates to anti-Black racism and the Black communities. So the Black Governance and Leadership Project, looking at those systems change ideas that we talked about earlier on, will address primarily the first two areas that we talked about, the structural change and the relational change, right? Boards and governance spaces and leadership spaces are responsible to bringing about policies, developing policies, establishing policies and practices and directions. And they're also responsible for the allocation of resources and earmarking resources for certain areas. So all the things that we reviewed earlier on and looking at the different programming and stuff like that, if this, at the decision-making table, some changes do not occur as it relates to the Black community, then we won't see any advancement in changes. It's the same thing at the board level and leadership level. That's where the relationship and connections are formed, whether it is within the organization or whether it is with external stakeholders and groups. It's the board that goes out and promotes the organization or establish stakeholder relationship. It's the leadership that creates partnerships. So and then the power dynamics as well within that, right? So how is power dynamics managed and navigated? So if those areas do not change, then I don't think we will see enough or significant change in our communities. And that's where we have been dealing with some, coming up with some programs or initiatives. And the Black Governance and Leadership Project came out of the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism. One of the recommendations from the action plan was to have initiatives in order to increase the representation of Black people on boards of in the city, boards of health and social service agencies. And I will show you some stats around what does that look like with regard to Black representations on board and leadership spaces. So what we did at Taibu is we formed a partnership with our key stakeholders that we have been working with, and then developed what is called the Black Governance and Leadership Project. And when, so the partnership is initiated with University of Toronto Scarborough, the East Scarborough Boys and Girls Club, the Alpha Alpha Delta Omega chapter of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, or we just say for short, the Toronto AKA chapter. And the idea was to develop a Black governance and leadership project and address one of the recommendations from the city. Initially, what the city had requested as a request for proposal was to get an organization who can develop a program whereby we can train Black community members and then match them to board opportunities, which was a significant move, right? But what we have done in our proposal is we presented the city with three phased approach to what the city was trying to do. We added two components to what the city was looking. The first one was we knew there were a lot of Black led grassroots emerging organizations, and some of them who have been around for quite some time, but either have, you know, some groups have come up and died, or some groups have really were not able to thrive because of their structure around board governance. So we said we really want to develop a module whereby, or a program or an initiative that will build the capacity of smaller grassroots community organizations, because without building those community organizations, we cannot grow as a community. And we said we would do that as phase one. As phase two, we said we would fulfill the requirement of the city by training members of the Black community, prepare them to take advantage of opportunities at different health and social service organizations, board and committees. And then on the third phase, though, we said, and this comes from the systems approach, is that we would engage with mainstream organizations and bring to those spaces, to those existing board spaces, an understanding of the impact of anti-Black racism and disrupting how governance happens, particularly as it relates to Black communities, because it's very easy for organizations to say, oh, we have a Black representative on our board and tick a box, right? It could become a tokenistic approach. So our conversation with the city was, if we don't change what is happening in existing boards, whereby their processes, their culture, their policies does not allow for equitable and meaningful participation of those voices, then we would have trained so many people and put them in places where it's actually could be a negative experience for them, because we know that existing boards and structures do not allow for equitable representation and meaningful engagement with marginalized and racialized voices. And I can attest to that. I sit at different tables, I sit at different committees, I sit at different boards, and I probably would be in most cases the only representative of from a Black as a Black person in those spaces. And it's not very easy, even though I have status, I have a title, I command some kind of privilege when I go to those places. But as a marginalized voice, it's not very easy for me to capitalize on the processes unless there are some changes in board culture. So what we said in our proposal was, we really want to engage mainstream organizations. It was a one-year funding, and we really wanted to make sure that, we said within 1 year, at least we will engage 2 mainstream organizations and see how we can engage them, so that they can also think about how they're going to change their policies, their practices, their cultures, their power dynamics, if they're going to have truly a meaningful engagement and participation from Black communities. So those were our 3 phases that we've done. We have also, and then here is some stats, and this is a very, very recent stat that came out a couple of months ago from Ryerson University, showing the kind of percentage of Black representation at different boards. And this is information from Toronto, for example. It's the Black population is about 8%, but you will see maybe in some municipal committees and boards, we have some good representation. But you look at provincial associations or board or committees, corporate boards, hospital boards, school boards, we are very much underrepresented, right? So, and the saying is true: if you're not at the table, you probably end up on the menu, right? Because somebody else is going to make a decision about a community, about a population, or about us. So this is where the Black Governance and Leadership Project came from, right? And in some other jurisdictions, it's even worse. Like, look at Montreal, right? And you look at Montreal, and the Black population there is about 6.8%, except for municipal, boards and committees. The Black community is not represented anywhere, in hospitals, in voluntary sector, in school boards, in university and colleges. I mean, this is very significant and very alarming. The same thing in Ottawa, right? Again, 6% of the population being from the Black community, nothing in municipal, nothing in hospital, nothing on school boards. And these are significant places where decisions and policies that impact and affect the Black community are made. And if there are no representations, then how are we going to really bring about any significant change for the community, or move directions of organizations or associations or services to meet the needs of the Black community? It's quite significant. And that's why the importance of having a Black governance project that has the focus on making sure that this happens. And so we have developed a kind of a logic model where we're looking at what are the causes, what is the vision, what are the strategies. And so, We don't have enough representation. That's a significant issue. We saw it from the statistics just now. We don't have capacity building programs for existing Black-led organizations. They're very cyclical. They depend on funding, right? And when the funding ends, groups disappear, groups die, right? We've seen this significantly when we had the Youth Challenge Fund. The Youth Challenge Fund, the City and United Way invested over $40 million in creating different programs that are youth-led for Black youth who were experiencing significant barriers in the community. Over $40 million. And about 180 or 150 plus groups and different programs were created. Youth groups and organizations, emerging organizations were created. Today, about 10, 12 years, 15 years later, only 3 organizations are existing. Only 3 organizations. Out of 100 and something groups, only 3 organizations have been able to thrive. The rest disappeared once the funding ended, right? We're doing the same thing again with the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan. There has been significant investment still going on, and now additional youth programs, groups, Black-led groups have come up. They're doing great work out there. Once the funding ends, if those groups are not supported to build their capacity around governance and leadership, they will die when the funding dies. And then we'll recreate these groups on a cyclical way. And that is going to be a significant challenge, right? So that's what we're trying to change. The other thing is also we have identified that we need more mentorship around governance and leadership. We don't have a very strong network among ourselves to support each other, to build each other, to occupy spaces that are important and decision making. So that's what the kind of logic model is looking at. And then the representation on boards, definitely, and then changing the dynamics of boards, as I said earlier on. One of the things I usually get to know when I speak to different boards is, and I see that they don't have enough racialized representation, and particularly our focus being the Black communities or the indigenous or the Francophone communities. I always ask them a question, say, how come, like you're in this area, significant number of your clients are from this community group, how come you don't have anything on your board? And they would say, oh, we have challenge in recruiting members of the community. And when you look at the system and the way that recruitment happens, you will find that there is a disconnect between the organization and the communities, and there are no relationships that are built. So that's what we're trying to do when we speak to boards, is also trying to look at the ways that they are doing their recruitment and how that is happening and whether they need to shift that, right? So some boards are very, very strong on skill-based assets, right? They will say, oh, we need to look for lawyers and financial people and this and that and communication people, and very seldom or very, they don't consider lived experiences, community experiences as significant to have on their board. So they're looking at technical skills, but they're not looking at lived experiences. So those are the kind of changes that we are trying to bring about and making sure that boards can also consider this information. So that's the kind of model, and I think the impact is we just don't want to increase the number of representation of Black people on boards. It is important, it is significant, and it has to happen. But without the boards themselves changing their culture, the way they're doing, and changing some of the things that would enable the meaningful and significant representation and participation of the community at their space, whether it's governance space or leadership space, then we would not have achieved the desired result of bringing about change. So this is how the systems change perspective is looking at. If we're not building, in year 2, we got an extension of the funding, and what we are doing right now in the second year of the project is we want to focus on building a pathway for youth to be engaged in governance and leadership capacity building, so that we can create already an existing kind of a pathway for young people today to be occupying space around governance and leadership tomorrow, right? So that is about sustainability and making sure that the resources continue to exist in the community and they are being built. So we are focusing our attention now to create a youth pathways for board governance and leadership, so that we have an ongoing flow of younger generation coming up to occupy spaces with the right skills, the right tools, and the right ammunition for them to advance the issue of anti-Black racism and Black Lives Matter around that. And then I mentioned again about the mentorship piece, because the mentorship is very, very important. This is how other communities have grown. They're very well connected. If you look at the Jewish community, if you look at the Italian community, right? And you would see how that network works in certain organizations where there is an easy flow of connecting people to different opportunities, to different spaces, and creating that. So that is the kind of model that we have around the Black governance and bringing about systems change. I know I've been talking too much, so I don't know. I hope there are some questions or even indications to say, yeah, this is information is helpful, or change gear and talk to us about something else. So if you have any comments, just put it on the Q&A so I can also hear where we are in terms of this conversation. I would really appreciate that. So now that I have given you a little bit of context around where the philosophy is coming from, what does it look like, what is the philosophy around that and why it is important, let me just talk a little bit about how we are doing this, right? I talked to you about phase one. Phase one, we really worked, for example, in the first year, and we have developed now a module to support young emerging groups. And what we've done with them is we made an assessment, or they made an assessment of their own groups and identified certain objectives. And then we conducted the training, which would include, basic governance 101 that everybody would benefit from. And we have kind of looked at those in 4 sections, because essentially what boards and governance spaces do is they plan. So for example, it could be the strategic plan or the strategic direction or priorities. They oversee. So they have fiduciary responsibility of overseeing what the organization does, whether it's financial oversight or other kind of operational oversight that the board has a responsibility about. Then the board engages. I think boards are also have a very, very important role in playing in developing relationship with different stakeholders, right? The boards engage with elected officials, or engaged with partners, collaborators, or they are the key people to do fundraising, so they engage with donors and foundations, right? So we do some training around that as well. So the board plans, the board oversees, the board engages. And one of the things that we have identified around board challenges is the board needs to preserve themselves. We've seen time and again, particularly in certain racialized communities, where we have challenges with boards and challenges happening, and then when the board is not functioning properly, then it impacts the organization or the vision or the work or the activities that that organization is doing. So we're also doing some training around how do board that preserves themselves, what are the pitfalls that they should be thinking ahead, anticipating ahead, and what are the systems that they should put in place in order to make sure that they can preserve the organization and the board. So those are the main areas. And then in addition to that, particularly for the Black communities, what we've done is added 2 components. One, the anti-Black racism component, and doing some capacity building around anti-Black racism. But 2, most importantly, that doing anti-Black racism work and Black Lives Matter movement work is very taxing. It's emotionally difficult. It also takes a lot of energy from us. And so we've also did some workshop training, capacity building around healing, because some of the engagement that we get into when we are in board spaces could be traumatizing or re-traumatizing for some people. So how can we think about healing and self-care? We added those two other elements, and it was like a 6-part session that we did, both for small group organizations and for phase 2 when we trained the individual members of the Black community. But when we came to doing really the governance work with existing mainstream organization, we really wanted to make sure that, number one, it's going to be something that would challenge them in a respectful manner, but have some very uncomfortable conversation. And so to explore accountability, to explore what it means to be an advocate for the community, and how can they move from acknowledging that anti-Black racism exists to finding out ways of becoming accountable to the communities, and then moving to the position of either becoming an advocate or building an ally relationship, is the kind of path that we have crafted for boards. First is about examining what is that particular board is doing, and I'll give you some examples as we move forward. And then once they have acknowledged and they have looked at their own practices, prejudices, privileges, and upbringing and all that kind of stuff, then moving to the second section, which is very important, is then how, now that you have acknowledged that this exists, that you now are committing to do some accountability work, can move into the advocacy and ally relationship position, so that you can now then advance some of the work your organization on your board should be responsible to be doing. That's the kind of frame that we are preparing our engagement, and it's very tailor-made for different organizations, because we want to tackle the issue that they're facing. If they are a health organization, then we will go with them with health information and impact of anti-Black racism around health. If it is a social service organization, we will do the same with them. And it's not one of those information sessions that usually people attend and then tick a box to say, yes, I have completed an equity, diversity, and inclusion training. There is a pre-reading that we require for board members to undertake. We have developed a workbook where during the sessions there are some activities and exercises that they have to do and reflect upon. And the reflection is also not just about their practices, but also about their own self-reflection. Some of the attitude, prejudices, and privileges that they enjoy, where is this coming from? Is it a belief system? Is it education? Is it lack of knowledge? Where does that land? And then we do some work around that to make sure that we're not just passing on information, but they are committing to do the work themselves during the session that we present them, and an ongoing basis that they will continue to do that. And so that is very, very important in terms of how we are engaging mainstream organizations. And I'll give you some examples, because now we're moving to this phase 3 project implementation. And then these are the questions that we would work with them and say, what action should we consider as governance or leadership space to confront anti-Black racism? How and when do we become an advocate? And how and when do we become an ally? And these are very, very important things, right? The board themselves may not, unless they are an advocate when they need to be an advocate, and unless they become an ally when they need to be an ally, there is no, at least in my personal belief, there is no path forwards to bring about change or systemic change when it relates to anti-Black racism. And we really drill down to have conversations around what do they understand as an advocate? When is it the right space and time to be an advocate? And when it is, and how do you develop ally relationship? Can you just jump into becoming an ally, or do you need to develop a strong relationship with community stakeholders and earn the possibility of becoming an ally, because you can't just be an ally, right? It's really not, doesn't work that way. You have to earn your ally positioning so that communities can trust you when instances of allyship present themselves. The same thing with advocacy, right? In order for you to advocate on behalf of a population or a community representing them, you need to earn that role or that privilege of being an advocate. So we do a lot of work around making sure that those are critical components of the change that should happen at the governance and space. So what have we done so far in terms of our implementation? I think the first thing that as an organization, we were very, very, I don't know, maybe I don't want to say the word lucky, because I don't think we were lucky, but I think there was some alignment that took place last year as we were developing our Black governance and leadership project. And we were at we were presented with this opportunity where we were doing a delegation at the Toronto Board of Health. And this was last year around December or November, I can't remember now. There was an opportunity to do delegations with regard to acknowledging community violence and to be addressed as a public health issue or with a public health approach. And so we were there presenting our delegation to the Board of Health, saying, here is how it's very important that you think of community violence as a public health issue and as a public health approach, because otherwise you won't be able to address the systemic issues that exist. Violence exists not because people want to be violent, but there are other social determinants of health that bring about the systemic issues and barriers that leads to the violence. Is just a symptom, it's not the cause, right? And so when we were doing that presentation and delegation, we also mentioned that work starts from home, and there needs to be some work around governance thinking and reflection, because unless the Board of Health is really in a position to bring about policies that are going to make sense to the community, nothing is going to change. And through that, the Board of Health agreed to participate in the work that our board governance and leadership project. They actually passed a motion in December. We were working towards developing and implementing the capacity building training session for the Board of Health. And I don't think that is the best place to start, the Board of Health being one of the highest boards in the city of Toronto. So that was very, very encouraging. It got delayed because of COVID, but we just had, about 3 weeks ago, we had our session with the Board of Health. It went very well. It was well received. It was, we're still waiting for all the evaluations to come up and to be compiled, but it was very engaging. They found it very useful for the work that they need to plan ahead. And something is good when somebody says, oh, we want you to come back and continue this conversation. So we have a callback again in 2021 to revisit what we have presented for them, so we can see if there has been any progress. And then we are working with several organizations, significant organizations. So we're working with the Catholic Children Aid Society and bringing the Black Governance and Leadership Project in those spaces. And in most cases, we are being very deliberate in our approach and engagement in seeking out collaboration and partnership with different organizations. We're looking at those ones that are predominantly working with Black communities, impacting the lives of Black communities. So that's what we are trying to do. And slowly we are getting there. We're working with school boards and see if we can develop and implement particular education-based board governance training and capacity building. Community health centers are approaching us to be able to do that with their boards. associations. There are a couple of associations I'm working with to define how best to approach this. And we are working with what we call here in Scarborough our anchor institutions. These are large institutions that remain in the community for the longest time and have huge potential and influence on the communities that they serve. So these include University of Toronto Scarborough, Centennial College, Scarborough Health Network, our merged hospitals, and Toronto Zoo. And they're all, have agreed that this is something that they want to do. And then we're also getting requests from other public health units. I had a conversation about a week ago from a public health unit in Sudbury. Wanting, I think they heard or they saw the social media communication with the Board of Health, and I think they're also interested to bring about those program in those areas. And I can imagine in places like Sudbury, at least here in Toronto, the conversation, the language is there, but there are some areas where there is a lot of work to be done. And then other community organizations that are approaching us also to be doing this work, both with the leadership as well as with their boards. And so when we go there, it's not just disrupting the process and the dynamic that is happening in the board, it's also working with them to make sure that they have a barrier-free process for community organizations to access their programs and services, to access their board and governance and leadership spaces without significant barriers, because that's also one of the areas where we need to do some work. And then just very briefly, I know I've been talking for the longest time, and I'm hoping that there's going to be so many questions so that we can have a conversation. But very briefly, maybe a couple of slides. I just wanted to show you some of the evaluation that we have received so far with phase 1 and phase 2 implementation. The evaluation for phase 3, because it was delayed because of COVID and we just started the implementation, will come forward. But the preliminary response that we got from Board of Health, for example, has been very positive. But you can see here in terms of the overall rating of the experiences when we did this with the smaller community organizations and with the individuals, is you can see how they have rated the experience of them engaging with Black Governance and Leadership Project. Was the content objectives clear? Was it engaging? Was the content included Afrocentric in its component? Some of the things that you can see that very positive feedback. But for me, I think this was for phase 1 and phase 2, this was a significant evaluation metrics for us. As you can see, this did an assessment at the start of the program. As I told you, we did an assessment with individuals, we did an assessment with smaller groups, and we did an assessment around their skills and knowledge and where they were at the end of the program and the session that they had. And you can see the shift where they had most of them had a fair knowledge around governance and Black leadership and anti-Black racism and all those kind of things. And the shift has moved significantly from fair to very good. Yes, if it would have been excellent, it would have been great, but it has shifted. So that was very encouraging for us to see that had happened when we did our program. And hopefully with phase 3, we would also be able to also have a similar, hopefully have a similar kind of a positive feedback, so that then we can create something that really is good, positive, and helpful for communities, as well as how governance and institutions can begin to see some ways of changing how they do practice governance. Lastly, just some pictures of some of the people who are involved, both the individual ones, the group ones, together with facilitators. And, people really committed themselves in going through those 6-part sessions over 6 weekends, full day weekends. And, the energy and the participation, the engagement was really very, very energetic. So I would stop there because I spoke for the longest time. There are a couple of questions here and I will answer them. So somebody asked for my contact detail. I'll put my email if that is okay, and respond to that. And do you work with Black grassroots organizations across the city or within a certain catchment area? No, we work around across the city. What we did when we implemented phase 1 and phase 2 was we made sure that we had as much as possible the cities covered. So when we selected small grassroots community organization, we made sure that, you know, there were some in the east and there were some in the west end as well. And we had all the kind of programs, similar programs happening here in the east and in the west. So when we had programs, groups, we had 5 groups. I believe 2 of the groups were on the west side and 3 of the groups were on the east side. And the east side would have a Saturday session and the west side would have a Sunday session, the same program happening at the same time. We did the same thing with the individual groups. We made sure that we recruited members from both the east side and the west side. And again, we did the 6 sessions parallel, you know, consecutive, concurrently on the east side and the west side. And there were a couple of sessions where we brought them together, like for example, the self-care and the anti-Black racism work. We brought them together because those were common things. And we also wanted to create a network of individuals and groups to know each other who have participated in a board governance. So yes, we do work with across the city. If it is required, we also have, you know, we can also, now that we have developed some of the programs and modules, we can also consider working with groups and individuals in the GTA as well, because sometimes boundaries are very artificial. People live in the GTA but work in the city, or live in the city and work in the GTA. So we want to make sure that those areas are also covered. So yes, we do that. Any other questions? Yes, so that's a very good question. Thank you. Are you still accepting new groups? So right now our focus, our primary focus is on the youth pathways and the mentorship project and the implementation of phase 3. But we know what the needs are, and sometimes the needs are pressing because there is a group that really wants to get together and come together and do some work so that they can continue, or it's maybe there is an opportunity for them to access resources, so they want to make sure that, you know, they're working together. So yes, we will do that, and we will make arrangements to make sure that we will provide support. Because now, you know, the first year was when we were testing of some of the programs, some of the plans, some of the workshop sessions and stuff. Now we can adjust it in a way that is also acceptable and workable with the new group. So yes, we will do that. And you know, I put my email there. I don't know if it was for everybody, but you can connect with us and we will take it as per case basis. Thank you for that question. That was really good. Any other questions or comments, or maybe feedback? It doesn't have to be a question, you know. It could also be a comment to say what you spoke about does not make sense at all. You got it wrong. Here is a better idea, or here is a better, you know, just to have a conversation would be very good. Oh, thank you for starting this as the Continental African Grass Group. Oh, okay. I think there's additional coming, right? This, I don't know, Huda, if you've completed your sentence or not, but I think I understand what you're saying. There are certain groups within the Black community that are further marginalized, require a lot of capacity building, and have not been able to participate meaningfully in opportunities that exist. And we, you know, like we have been talking about this for the longest time. And I think this is a good opportunity really to support some of the continental African grassroots community organizations to build their capacity so that they can then present, like take advantage of when opportunities arise. I think that's a very, very good question. And I see that happening in a lot of spaces. I get the opportunity to go to different meetings, to different tables, to different forums, and um, the continental African groups are not represented, right? So sometimes opportunities are missed. Sometimes when decisions are made, the issue that the continental African community experiences, which is different from other communities, right? And again, within the continental African communities, there are also different marginalizations, as we all know, right? If you're from the continental African community and then you're Francophone, right? You're then further marginalized because the language barrier and other issues happen. Or if you are from certain other communities, whether East, whether West, whether, North African. So I think there is an opportunity here to also support those continental African grassroots community organizations. And the question that you also raised around the turmoil is also an issue, right? So I think sometimes capacity and lack of capacity and strength and structure brings about challenges in terms of either communication or moving together as a team, right? So some of the things that we have been discussing in our education piece, when we did, for example, the board preserves, those were the questions that we were talking about. How do we make sure that the board is preserved, right? So that not individual agendas are really pushed, right? Because as a board, it's a unit, it's one unit, right? So how can you preserve that unity with different opinions, all right? There are certain things that are helpful if you have systems in place, policies in place, then you can make sure that those kind of things do not happen. So that's why we added the board preserve section, is something that we added and made sure that it was added in our communication conversation, because that's, as you said, that is where most of the challenges usually happen, and we've seen it, right? And like we still survive because we are a community that does a lot of survival, and either the organization goes through a turmoil and then survives, and then goes on for a good time, and then something else happens. But the challenge is when we're going up and down, all these other opportunities for our communities are being missed because we're not presenting themselves at those tables. So this is why I think a program like this, the Black Governance Leadership Project, that brings the kind of anti-Black racism lens, the challenges faced, the barriers faced, and talks about all these issues and provides some kind of mentorship and leadership, is going to be helpful. We have a website, I think it's called www.bglp.ca or .com. And then what we want to do also is, now we just created the website recently, and we want to add resources there so that when either individuals who want to go into governance spaces, or even organizations who are thinking about who are thinking about sorry, my screen went, that's why I'm just okay. Who want some resources around board governance and stuff can access that. Would be something that would be all helpful. So you can also visit the website. I've given you my email as well. So if you let me know, I would be very happy to provide information, maybe start conversations. Maybe we can also find support for community organizations. Thank you for those questions. I really appreciate that. Any other comments, questions, and reflections? We have 10 minutes, so we can talk. You can ask other questions if you want to as well. You can ask, you know, questions that are not related to Black governance if there are any other questions that you want to ask. But that was my presentation. I'm hoping it was useful. Hopefully it was useful. I probably assume that there's going to be some kind of an evaluation. So it will be good to see that if you are able to complete the evaluation. I don't know if there are any other comments or reflections around the information that was presented, or if there's any information you want to receive around Taibu Community Health Center as well. I'll be happy to entertain those questions. Maybe I can ask a question. I don't know if people are okay to answer the question, but are any of the participants today part of any board or are considering to be on boards? We have another maybe 6-7 minutes to go through. So let me engage you in some conversations. If you're okay to share information, that's all. Are anybody on boards right now or are thinking of joining any boards? Okay, nobody is engaging me. Okay. Maybe not. Okay, that's fine. So thank you very much. I think if there are no other questions or no other conversations to be had, I really appreciate the time that you spent with me this afternoon. Please connect with me if you have any other further questions. I'm hoping that this information has been useful for the work that you do, and I look forward to engaging with you in another opportunity. But thank you very much.